Alright, since I know you're all clamoring to hear my thoughts on this, obviously, I thought I would include what I would say is an irregular video in this interregnum on the normal channel to highlight a current topic that's quite contentious at the moment, which is this two-tier policing. So it's been accused of Keir Starmer to the degree that he has enabled what is viewed as harsher policing on native Britons versus lenient policing on immigrants. And in general, this is obviously one of those core motivators for protesting and rioting, I think, in a lot of these different communities, is that there is this felt grievance and potentially disfavourable treatment that they're receiving. The iniquity, I would assume, is probably some combination of real and perceived, rather than necessarily all real or all perceived. There's always going to be a mixture. It also depends on which community and which police force is involved. So what I'll do in the video today is two things. First, I want to explain the policeman as an entity, as a person, and what exactly goes into the motivations of a policeman and why that can be important. And then secondly, why it's actually not two-tier policing, but it's the two-tier political treatment of criminals and or reprobates and in general you might call it potentially criminal class. So we have to understand that policing is just a mechanism of the state to enforce violence and keep peace. I think in general in the UK, police are either traditionally seen as bobbies, almost paternally roaming streets and keeping peace and having crumpets and tea with locals and all this sort of stuff. You see a lot of the work behind utilizing female policemen in this way because they have been trained to be more disarming, and it's less likely that a violent male will be violent in the presence of a woman. So there's a strong emphasis on both this conditional psychological treatment of potential criminals or reprobates versus what you could call the progressivism of opening a police force to have all sorts of different type of personalities involved. But obviously when we think of police, you kind of think of this thin blue line of all these people who are more or less the same in a lot of ways. So the backgrounds of police officers, their IQ scores, their OSHA scores, their backgrounds are all fairly similar, and you'll find that they almost form a class themselves in terms of civil servant class, and particularly the more militant arm of the civil service, whereby you understand that people who are probably a little bit less intelligent but a bit more orientated towards physical and personal interactivity, extroversion, etc., would be more likely to be police. But there won't be too much of a difference between the median IQ and that of a policeman versus a standard civil servant who works for the post office or something. And then once we can understand and conceptualize that most of the police, and in this instance riot police, have familiarity with dealing with hooliganism and soccer games where there's been a lot of these disruptions that are very, very similar in nature, with young men kicking, screaming, throwing things, trying to fight each other, punching. So the UK actually is quite practiced at this type of engagement. What the qualms are situated, and this has been glozed by Starmer here, in terms of the application of riot police has been inconsistent. So there have been more emphasis and focus on regions which particularly were only native Britons and English people trying to voice their frustrations, versus where there was probably an occasion for the immigrant communities to come bearing weapons and running amok and particularly where there was a high likelihood of incidences of violence or other disruptions. So the inability for Starmer to very clearly enunciate and elucidate what his plan was, because he was very, you could say, politically naive around how he felt the situation lay, in terms of, I'm coming across as the adult here, telling you as the schoolmaster, this boy is being the disruptive one in class, which is his whole demeanour as a school teacher, which is why it's very ineffective as a leader more than it is an authority figure, which he's probably used to given his status as previously a barrister and a legal entity. Now, the vocation of a policeman is varied. There's not that much training, particularly around violent situations. It's mostly around gear qualification in dealing with taking orders and how exactly formations are. So a lot of the people involved in this type of policing do see it as potentially a job that they go to every day, and that once a month, once every 6 months, whenever it is they're called up to be a riot in riot gear and effectively being riot police in this way it's seldom, it's rare than their normal job, which is obviously just their career and how they get their pants on in the mornings and go to work and eat lunch with each other and discuss random things. So they're not this different entity in a quotidian sense, but only in the special circumstances. And this is where that friend-enemy distinction from Carl Schmitt comes into play, and the policemen are very much banded together in this identity of we're in it for each other, the Three Musketeers style, one for all for one, versus whoever it is, this element, this bad and evil enemy. And in this instance, the police are more or less, call it innocent, but their directive is all commanded to them. They have no real autonomy here. There's no volition when it comes to what they're doing and why they're doing it. It's all, you do this because it's an order, and this is where their training comes into, say, put the suit on, go out and quell the disruption. And that's it. That's the mentality they have. If you've ever seen anyone taking orders, you know that instinctively they just do. There's no questioning of authority, of motives, or anything like that. Anyone who had cared to the degree about the causes would have called in sick, they wouldn't have shown up, they would be derelict in their duty, or they wouldn't have been a police officer at all. If your sister was one of the victims of a grooming gang, it's unlikely you would have joined the police force for any other reason than to punish those you've seen as the malefactors. Rather than necessarily, I don't know anyone who's been a victim other than they were in the newspaper. So personally, I'm not affected to the level that I'm going to care if I'm situated in an environment where I'm protecting these innocent girls, or I'm just normal police jobbing myself through society. And the social construct in the UK is fairly complex, but in this dimension it's actually rather simple, is that there's a long history of the police as a force used to quell underclasses. So the only disruption in the UK you'll find from this almost political sense is from the working class, and there's been many economic disruptions which have caused them to rebel and riot. The Pinkertons in America in the turn of the last century were a big force around these exact same issues, but a private police force. But the idea and the occasions are fairly similar, where you have an economic privation and very angry and disreputable men rabble-rousing, and then you have a deployment of a force against them. So this enemy is conjured on both sides in a way that allows for violence to take place. No one's going to have that much energy to throw stones and pull apart brick and mortar houses or buildings or businesses, because once there's a flame set or you've kicked in windows, that's basically it. Now there'll be some looting, etc., but more or less the violence aspect is only fueled by an interacting. You can't interact with a tree or a wall or a building as much as you can in terms of just trying to destroy it, and then that's it, fizzles out. Which is why you get this feeling of the faceless policemen in these situations. They have the helmet on, they have the visor, the vest, and this is to engage psychologically this us versus them. You can see this, I think, in a leitmotif here with Judge Dredd, and he's quite a good epitome of this, not necessarily good or bad, just dutiful man, And Immanuel Kant was obviously a big proponent of duty as a moral service, and so if you've understood your duty as to be protecting the citizens or upholding the legal structure and frameworks of the law in this sense, then you are the good guy to yourself, and everybody in their own narrative perceives themselves as the good guy. It just is the natural way of living. You also have to understand that these policemen and policewomen are not paid that well. So you get a little chart here, and I can zoom in a little bit here. But the pay for a policeman, and this is probably most of the ones that are riot police, is fairly low. You have to understand that this is not a situation where there's a huge fear about losing a lot of money if they act in certain ways where they might be disbarred from participating in the police force, because if you are fired from a £30,000 job a year, it's not exactly the case that it's that difficult to find another one. So there's a low operational threat, and a risk, I should say, in terms of what the conduct of a policeman is. In terms of latitude, they're given quite a lot, because there's not that much to lose personally for them, and they have to only act in accordance with the situation, and they have quite a strong union, and there's a lot of legal precedents around what they can and cannot do, and there's a political will to allow them to, as I said, have a lot of latitude when it comes to policing actions. So you'll find them beating protesters or being really rough with rioters and etc. Because, once again, there's a political appetite for that sort of behaviours. And then all these kind of three things form the policeman as we see them as a concept. You might personally know a policeman, or you are a policeman, or you've interacted with them, and you can treat them individually, obviously, in a lot of ways, but when it comes to a riot situation, they are a monolithic force of faceless, helmeted, shielded men. And this in the UK system is operated under this justice and legal banner, or pyramid, parasol, with the most importance on this, and this is kind of the transition where we go into why it's not a policing fault or a policing matter necessarily. That's more of a Picayune issue. The biggest problem, and this is very clear, is the political will towards policing certain communities. I think it's fairly specious to talk directly to the police themselves and how they act. They act on warrants, they act on investigative principles. They have a very strict way of how they're allowed to proceed on things. Now, if you have and this is the case in America and a lot of those blue states and cities, where if prosecution is very lenient and the punishments and sentencing are non-existent for crimes like theft or minor assault, battery, grand theft auto, then the police are less inclined to actually do their jobs in the sense of protecting a community from certain behaviours, because they know if they arrest somebody, then the incentive for that person to not do that because of the sentencing is non-existent, and therefore there's no point in me arresting that person. So there is a mechanism by which the feedback loop, you might call it, operates in a certain way to incentivise certain policing behaviours. But in the UK, it is much more around political will on these subjects, particularly, like I say, rioting, etc., where if you have a Prime Minister telling you that there will be faster, quicker, harsher sentencing with as much political will and resources as they can possibly dump into it, while simultaneously saying that there's a huge budget deficit and they need to cut all of these promised spendings around different areas, and that there'll be the need for borrowing perhaps, and that there is most likely a time for austerity in a lot of communities, it's a fairly hard pill to swallow that there happens to be money for something that he wants, and it's not necessarily beneficial to the same people that he'll also be punishing in other ways. So you can see why there's this feeling of two-tier existence, but I think in the UK at least it's very naive to think that this hasn't existed for the last 150 years, but just based on class. So if you're a managerial class, middle class, etc., you've already had a two-tier policing system where the underclass has been treated much differently, and which is, I think, self-admittedly, you say the underclass produces more of the core criminal class, So it's not necessarily that we're using bad inductive or deductive reasoning here, but it's mostly around the treatment of the poor and how they suffer from the behaviors and interactions from each other. So like poor people attacking poor people is not as police as if a poor person attacks a middle class person, or two middle class people potentially run a racket or some Ponzi scheme or something which affects really rich people, which is obviously then also punished fairly heavily. So you have to understand that the way the victim mentality works in the UK is very much tiered. It's already this hierarchical victimhood, where the better off you are and the more promising you are, and etc., the more value you have from a jurisdictional and legal standpoint. And there will obviously be flat denial, because obviously politicians like to presume that there's this fairness and equality before the law involved, which we all know is nonsense, but politicians like to pretend, and they will communicate that this is some non-existent and aberrant feature of a system that's working actually fairly effectively, etc., etc. Which is, I think, it's emblematic of the political class in the UK in its convergence around wanting power for the wrong reasons, and not necessarily heeding the will of the people. And when there is a growing disparate class in terms of wealth now with the UK, where it's much harder to afford a house for the lower classes, it's much harder to find work, find a sort of this career path of betterment, self-betterment, then the political class is obviously only interacting with the middle class that's ever shrinking from a relative standpoint. So you are just having a burgeoning lower class. Then you're always going to try and glose these factors in ways that minimizes the magnitude of punishment and the direction of policy is always to this middle class, which is shrinking because of the way that the UK electorate is elected. There's no need in a two-party system to actually have the will of the people be felt, and even if there was 40 million lower class people feeling annoyed, you can never corral them in a two-party system to vote for change, because you've seen with the UK Reform Party and the Lib Democrats, they managed to receive a majority of the votes nationally, and then it's still only able to field between them something like 80 MPs. So that's to say, before finishing up here, the focus should be on a political will to police being two-tiered, and that it is the case that this is not new, but it's being felt in a way, and the ramifications of it are now so evident, I think, to everybody, that we'll kind of conclude here on a quote from Carl Schmitt, which I really liked, from Concept of the Political, where he says, "For the application of such means, a new and essentially pacifist vocabulary has been created. War is condemned, but executions, sanctions, punitive expeditions, pacifications, protection of treaties, international police, and measures to assure peace remain." And I think you can see this internally in the UK, and how they're gone about the redressing what they consider the malicious rioting. "The adversary is thus no longer called an enemy, but a disturber of peace, and is thereby designated to be an outlaw of humanity. A war waged to protect or expand economic power must, with the aid of propaganda, turn into a crusade and into the last war of humanity. This is implicit in the polarity of ethics and economics, a polarity astonishingly systematic and consistent. But this allegedly non-political and apparently even anti-political system serves existing or newly emerging friend-enemy groupings and cannot escape the logic of the political." So letting that sit with you, I think it's best to bear witness to the exact description Carl Schmitt gives of the modern UK system, where we're saying no longer is this addressed in terminology that you would consider fair to the aggrieved parties, but it's very much the authority telling you that you're the enemy and the outlaw of humanity, rather than necessarily you have a recognized and appreciated grievance that you're trying to express. So putting you into this bucket of enemy, which is what they're doing, and as soon as they can consolidate the bucket of enemies and they can start prosecuting, then they can positively show this person was prosecuted, therefore must be guilty, therefore is a bad person, and will get punished. And then if you want to be associated with these criminals, which is what they'll now be able to call them, so you can kind of see how you can denote someone as a criminal and as evil just by the process of them expressing their grievances to what I think is definitely a legitimate cause. But the cause is illegitimate because there's no party representing the legitimacy. And in the UK, it's impossible. The Tories will never take up the flag on this. Their risk to reward ratio is rather low, and their leader, Rishi, is not a leader at all, but just a schoolboy. And then on the opposite flag, obviously Labour has picked what team or who they consider their friends in this way. So I think we should be prepared to see what is some very harsh reckonings from a Labour-led political arm directed towards this underclass.